The camera clicked off, but Catherine's hands were still trembling. In that single moment, the future Queen of England had done something unprecedented in modern royal history. She had looked directly into the lens and spoken words that would change everything. "I owe you an explanation," she had whispered, her voice carrying the weight of months of speculation, conspiracy theories, and a public that had grown increasingly restless with each passing day of silence. What had started as routine medical procedure had spiraled into the most significant royal crisis in decades. The woman who had once been the people's princess, beloved and accessible, had vanished from public view, leaving behind only carefully crafted statements and a growing storm of questions that palace officials seemed powerless to answer. But now, as the world held its breath, Catherine was ready to break her silence. The truth she was about to reveal would not only explain her absence, but would fundamentally change how the monarchy approached transparency, vulnerability, and the delicate balance between private struggle and public duty. This is the story of how a princess found her voice in the darkest of times, and how her courage to speak would ripple through the corridors of Buckingham Palace and into the hearts of millions around the world. The first sign that something was different came on a cold January morning when Catherine's scheduled visit to a children's hospital in Birmingham was quietly cancelled. Her private secretary, Sarah, had made the call personally, citing a minor scheduling conflict. It seemed routine enough, the kind of last-minute change that happened frequently in the complex world of royal engagements. But for those who knew Catherine well, the cancellation felt unusual. The Princess of Wales had always shown particular dedication to her charitable work with children, often insisting that such engagements take priority over other obligations. Sarah found herself fielding more questions than usual from the hospital's administrators, who seemed genuinely disappointed rather than merely understanding. Dr. Margaret Thompson, the hospital's chief pediatrician, had been looking forward to showing Catherine their new wing for young cancer patients. She had worked with the princess's team for months to arrange the visit, coordinating with families who had specifically requested time off work to meet their future queen. When the cancellation came through, Dr. Thompson felt something she couldn't quite name, a small knot of concern that settled uncomfortably in her stomach. The palace's official statement was brief and businesslike. The Princess of Wales would be taking a temporary step back from public duties following a planned abdominal surgery. The procedure had been successful, they assured the public, and she was expected to make a full recovery. She would resume her royal duties after Easter, giving her ample time to heal and spend time with her family. Media outlets reported the news with the respectful tone typically reserved for royal medical matters. The palace had always been protective of the family's health information, sharing only what was necessary to inform the public while maintaining privacy. Most journalists accepted the explanation without question, understanding that recovery from abdominal surgery could indeed require several months of rest. However, in the digital age, silence creates its own narrative. Social media began to buzz with questions that traditional news outlets wouldn't dare ask openly. Why had no one seen Catherine entering or leaving any of London's major private hospitals? Why were there no leaked photos from hospital staff or visitors when such images typically surfaced within days of any royal medical procedure? Rebecca Martinez, a royal correspondent for one of Britain's most respected newspapers, began receiving calls from her sources within the palace walls. These were people she had cultivated relationships with over years of coverage, from junior staff members to senior advisors who occasionally provided background information on royal activities. But this time, her sources seemed unusually tight-lipped. Even those who typically shared harmless details about the family's daily routines claimed to know nothing beyond the official statement. This silence struck Rebecca as more telling than any leaked information could have been. In her 15 years covering the royal family, she had never encountered such complete information blackout. The weeks stretched on, and February arrived without any updates on Catherine's condition. The palace continued to issue brief statements when pressed by media outlets, always maintaining that the princess was recovering well and would return to public duties as planned. But the lack of any candid photos, informal sightings, or even social media posts from family members began to create an atmosphere of uncertainty. William's public appearances during this time were scrutinized with unprecedented intensity. Royal watchers and body language experts analyzed every facial expression, every pause in his speech, searching for clues about his wife's true condition. He maintained his composure with the practiced skill of someone born into public life, but those closest to him noticed subtle changes in his demeanor. During the visit to a homeless shelter in London, William seemed more distant than usual. He performed his duties with his characteristic warmth and genuine interest, but staff members later remarked that he appeared tired, perhaps even stressed. When a volunteer mentioned hoping to see Catherine at future events, William's smile faltered for just a moment before he recovered with a practiced response about her focusing on recovery. The children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, had been noticeably absent from their usual public appearances as well. The family's annual skiing holiday, a tradition that typically generated weeks of positive media coverage, was quietly cancelled. School pickups and drop-offs, once regular opportunities for paparazzi to capture casual family moments, were now being handled entirely by protection officers and nannies. Mrs. Henderson, who ran a small cafe near the children's school, had grown accustomed to occasionally spotting Catherine during the school run. The princess had always been remarkably normal in these moments, waiting in her car like any other parent, sometimes popping in for coffee when she arrived early. But as February turned to March, Mrs. Henderson realized she hadn't seen Catherine in months. The absence began to affect the atmosphere at the school as well. Other parents, who had grown comfortable with the idea of royalty in their midst, started to wonder aloud about Catherine's well-being. The speculation remained respectful, born of genuine concern rather than mere curiosity, but it added to the growing sense that something significant was happening behind palace walls. Meanwhile, Catherine's charitable organizations began to feel the impact of her absence. The Early Childhood Development Foundation she had championed for years was scheduled to launch a major new initiative in March. Staff members found themselves in the awkward position of planning events without knowing whether their patron would be able to participate. Emma Collins, who had worked closely with Catherine on the foundation's projects, felt particularly conflicted. She had developed a genuine friendship with the princess over the years, built on their shared passion for supporting young families. But when Emma reached out through official channels to inquire about Catherine's involvement in the upcoming launch, she received only formal responses from palace staff. The professional relationship had always included personal touches. Catherine would often ask about Emma's own children, remember details about their activities and achievements. She had even sent a handwritten note when Emma's mother had been ill the previous year. The sudden shift to purely official communication felt cold and concerning. As March progressed, the questions grew louder and more pointed. International media outlets, less constrained by the genteel conventions of the British press, began running stories speculating about everything from marital problems to serious health issues. Social media influencers and conspiracy theorists filled the information vacuum with increasingly wild theories. The palace found itself in an impossible position. Providing more details about Catherine's condition would violate the family's privacy, something they had always fiercely protected. But maintaining silence was allowing speculation to grow beyond their control, potentially damaging both Catherine's reputation and the monarchy's credibility. Senior advisors held multiple emergency meetings throughout March, debating how to handle the growing crisis. Some argued for releasing additional medical information to quiet the speculation. Others insisted that giving in to public pressure would set a dangerous precedent, opening the door for increased scrutiny of the family's private lives. Queen Camilla, who had developed a close relationship with Catherine over the years, became increasingly concerned about the situation's impact on both the immediate family and the institution of the monarchy. During private conversations with Charles, she expressed worry that the silence was creating more problems than it was solving. The international implications were also becoming apparent. Commonwealth countries, where Catherine was particularly popular, were seeing increased Republican sentiment as people questioned the monarchy's transparency. Republican groups in Australia and Canada used Catherine's absence as evidence that the royal family was out of touch with modern expectations of public accountability. By late March, with Easter approaching and Catherine's promised return date looming, the pressure had reached a breaking point. Palace staff reported receiving hundreds of calls daily from media outlets around the world. The official social media accounts were flooded with comments demanding updates on the princess's condition. William faced increasing pressure during his public appearances to provide more information about his wife's well-being. During a visit to a veterans centre, a former serviceman directly asked him how Catherine was doing, creating an awkward moment that was captured by every camera present. William's response, while gracious, was noticeably evasive, further fueling speculation about what the family was hiding. The situation reached a critical point when aerial photographs emerged showing the grounds of their country home, with no signs of activity or presence. Long-lens photographers had camped outside their various residences for weeks, hoping to catch a glimpse of Catherine, but their vigil had yielded nothing. As Easter weekend arrived, bringing with it Catherine's self-imposed deadline for returning to public duties, the palace faced an unprecedented crisis of public trust. The silence that had been intended to protect the princess's privacy had instead created a storm of speculation that threatened to overwhelm everything the royal family had worked to build. The decision about what to do next would require courage, vulnerability, and a willingness to break with decades of royal tradition. It was a decision that would ultimately rest with Catherine herself, if she was indeed well enough to make it. The conversation that would change everything began on a quiet Tuesday evening in early April at Adelaide Cottage. Catherine sat across from William in their private sitting room, the same space where they had shared countless intimate discussions about their future, their children, and their roles within the monarchy. But tonight felt different, weighted with decisions that would affect not just their family but millions of people around the world. Catherine had been home for weeks now, recovering not just from surgery but from something far more complex and frightening. The routine procedure that had been announced to the public had revealed something unexpected, something that had turned her world upside down and forced her to confront mortality in a way she never had before. The doctors at the London clinic had been cautiously optimistic from the beginning. Dr. Joe Valla, Sarah Williams, Catherine's longtime physician, had explained that while the discovery during surgery had been unexpected, early intervention often led to successful outcomes. But the word that had hung in the air, unspoken but present in every conversation, was one that Catherine had never imagined would apply to her at 42 years old. Cancer. The diagnosis had come as a shock not just to Catherine, but to everyone in her inner circle. She had felt well before the surgery, active and engaged with her royal duties and family life. The abdominal discomfort that had led to the procedure had seemed minor, the kind of issue that could be quickly resolved and forgotten. But as she lay in her hospital bed in those first days after the operation, listening to Dr. Williams explain the pathology results and the treatment plan that would follow, Catherine had felt as though she was hearing about someone else's life. The woman who had always been so composed, so ready to face any challenge that came with her royal role, found herself struggling to process this most personal of battles. William had been by her side through every conversation with the medical team, his own shock and fear carefully controlled but visible to someone who knew him as well as Catherine did. They had faced public scrutiny, media storms, and the constant pressure of their royal positions together, but this felt different. This was something that all their training and preparation had never equipped them to handle. The decision to keep the diagnosis private had not been made lightly. In those early weeks after the surgery, as Catherine began the first rounds of preventative chemotherapy, the palace communications team had worked overtime to maintain the fiction that she was simply recovering from a routine procedure. The treatments had been more difficult than anyone had anticipated. Catherine, who had always prided herself on her physical fitness and energy, found herself exhausted by activities that had once seemed effortless. The nausea, the fatigue, and the emotional weight of the diagnosis had left her feeling like a shadow of herself. During those long weeks at home, she had watched from a distance as speculation about her absence grew increasingly wild and hurtful. Social media had become a place she could no longer visit, filled with conspiracy theories that ranged from the merely incorrect to the deeply cruel. Some suggested she was hiding cosmetic surgery, others claimed she was in rehab, and still others invented elaborate stories about marital problems and family drama. The children had been told the truth in terms they could understand, but protecting them from the public speculation had become increasingly difficult. George, at 10, was old enough to overhear conversations and ask probing questions. Charlotte and Louis, younger but equally perceptive, had noticed the change in their family's routine and their mother's frequent fatigue. One evening in late March, as Catherine helped Charlotte with her homework, her daughter had asked innocently when Mummy would start doing her princess work again. The question had brought tears to Catherine's eyes, not because she was sad, but because she realized how much she missed the work that had become such a central part of her identity. Her charitable organizations were suffering in her absence, not because they lacked capable leadership, but because her personal involvement had been such a driving force behind their success. The early childhood development initiative she had worked on for years was proceeding without her, but staff members reported that donors and partners were asking pointed questions about her continued involvement. Emma Collins from the Foundation had been particularly persistent in her attempts to reach Catherine directly. Through mutual friends outside the palace structure, Emma had tried to convey her personal concern and support, but the protective walls around the royal family had made such communication impossible. The isolation had been one of the hardest parts of the experience for Catherine. As someone who had always drawn energy from her public interactions and charitable work, being confined to her private world had felt suffocating. The people she met through her royal duties weren't just professional contacts. Many had become genuine connections that enriched her life and gave meaning to her role. Dr. Margaret Thompson from the Birmingham Children's Hospital had sent a personal letter through official channels, not asking for information about Catherine's condition, but simply expressing how much the children and families had been looking forward to her visit. The letter had included drawings from young patients, pictures of princesses and castles created by children, who were fighting their own battles with illness. Reading those letters and seeing those drawings had been a turning point for Catherine. These children, some no older than her own, were facing challenges that made her own seem manageable in comparison. Yet they had taken time to create something beautiful for her, to send their love and best wishes to someone they had never met, but who represented hope and kindness in their world. It was then that Catherine began to consider the possibility of sharing her truth with the world. The decision terrified her, not because she was ashamed of her diagnosis, but because she understood the magnitude of what such a revelation would mean for her family, for the monarchy, and for the millions of people who looked to the royal family for stability and continuity. William had been supportive but cautious when she first broached the subject. His instinct, honed by years of protecting his family from public scrutiny, was to maintain their privacy at all costs. He had seen what excessive media attention had done to his mother, and he was determined not to let history repeat itself with Catherine. But Catherine's perspective was different. She had come to understand that her silence, intended to protect her privacy, was actually causing more harm than good. The speculation and conspiracy theories were not just annoying, they were actively damaging her reputation and the public's trust in the royal family. More importantly, she had begun to realize that her experience with cancer could serve a purpose beyond her own healing. Cancer was something that touched virtually every family in Britain at some point. By sharing her story, she could help reduce the stigma and fear that surrounded the disease, while also encouraging others to seek early medical attention for concerning symptoms. The conversations with her medical team had been encouraging. Dr. Williams had explained that Catherine's prognosis was excellent, particularly because the cancer had been discovered early and the initial treatment had been aggressive and thorough. While she would need ongoing monitoring and possibly additional treatment, the expectation was for a full recovery and a normal lifespan. This positive outlook had given Catherine the confidence to consider stepping back into public life, but she knew that doing so without addressing the speculation would be impossible. The questions would never stop, and the gap between the public narrative and her private reality would only continue to grow. The decision to make a public statement had crystallized during a family dinner in early April. George had mentioned something he had overheard at school about his mother being in hiding, and Catherine had realized that even her children were being affected by the rumors and speculation. If she couldn't protect them from the fallout of her silence, then perhaps it was time to try a different approach. The logistics of creating such a statement were complex. The palace communications team, led by Simon Case, had never dealt with a situation quite like this. Royal medical information had traditionally been shared in the most minimal terms possible, with the family's privacy taking absolute precedence over public curiosity. But Catherine was insisting on something unprecedented, a personal, direct communication with the public that would acknowledge her diagnosis and treatment while maintaining appropriate boundaries around her family's privacy. She wanted to speak in her own words, with her own voice, about her own experience. The decision to use video rather than a written statement had been Catherine's idea. She felt that the speculation and conspiracy theories had dehumanized her, turning her into a mysterious figure rather than a real person facing a real challenge. By looking directly into the camera and speaking in her own voice, she could reclaim her narrative and remind the public that she was not just a princess, but a mother, a wife, and a woman dealing with something that millions of families faced. The location for filming had been chosen carefully. Rather than using one of the formal rooms at Kensington Palace or Windsor Castle, Catherine had opted for the garden at Adelaide Cottage, the family home where she had spent much of her recovery. The setting was intimate and personal, suggesting the private conversation she wanted to have with the public. The writing process had been collaborative but deeply personal. While palace communications staff provided technical advice and helped ensure that the statement would be appropriate for official release, the words were Catherine's own. She had spent hours crafting each sentence, wanting to strike the right balance between honesty and privacy, between vulnerability and strength. As she prepared for the filming, Catherine understood that this single statement would mark a turning point not just in her own life, but in the relationship between the royal family and the British public. She was about to break decades of precedent by sharing something deeply personal and frightening, trusting that her honesty would be met with understanding and support rather than exploitation and judgment. The morning of the filming dawned bright and clear, as if nature itself was cooperating with Catherine's decision to finally tell her truth. She had barely slept the night before, not from anxiety about her health, but from the weight of knowing that in a few hours she would share something with the world that she had barely been able to say aloud to her closest family members. William had woken early and found her in the kitchen, already dressed and nursing a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, and they stood together in comfortable silence, both understanding the magnitude of what lay ahead. Their children were still sleeping upstairs, blissfully unaware that their mother was about to make history. The film crew from the BBC had arrived at Adelaide Cottage at dawn, working quietly to set up their equipment in the garden. Catherine had specifically requested a small team, people she had worked with before and trusted to handle such a sensitive moment with the discretion and respect it deserved. The director, James Mitchell, had covered royal events for over a decade and understood the delicate balance between public interest and personal dignity. As Catherine walked through her garden that morning, touching the flowers that were just beginning to bloom with spring's arrival, she thought about all the people who would see her message. She thought about the children in Dr. Thompson's hospital ward, about Emma Collins and the foundation staff who had been loyally waiting for her return, about the countless families dealing with their own cancer diagnoses who might find some comfort in knowing they were not alone. The decision to film outside had been purposeful. Catherine wanted people to see her as she truly was in this moment, not hidden behind the formal trappings of royalty, but standing in natural light, surrounded by life and growth and renewal. The garden represented hope, the promise that even in the darkest seasons, spring would eventually come. The makeup artist had worked carefully to help Catherine look her best while maintaining the naturalness she wanted to convey. The chemotherapy had taken some toll, subtle changes that only those closest to her would notice, but she was determined not to appear as a victim. This was not a plea for sympathy, but an honest conversation between friends. When it came time to begin filming, Catherine felt a calmness settle over her that surprised everyone, including herself. For months, she had been living with the burden of keeping this secret, of managing other people's expectations while dealing with her own fears and uncertainties. Now, finally, she was about to lift that weight and share it with the people who had supported her throughout her years in public life. She had practiced the words, but she had decided not to read from a script. This needed to be authentic, a genuine conversation with the camera that would translate into a genuine conversation with every person who watched. She thought of it as speaking to one person at a time, as if she was sitting across from each viewer in their own living room. I wanted to take this opportunity to say thank you personally for all the wonderful messages of support and for your understanding while I've been recovering from surgery, she began, her voice steady but warm. It has been an incredibly tough couple of months for our entire family, but I've been surrounded by love and support from William and our children, which has been incredibly important to me. As she spoke these opening words, Catherine felt the last of her nervousness disappear. This was right. This was what she should have done weeks ago, instead of hiding behind palace statements and official silence. The people who had supported her throughout her royal journey deserved to hear from her directly. In January, I underwent major abdominal surgery in London, and at the time, it was thought that my condition was non-cancerous. The surgery was successful, however. Tests after the operation found cancer had been present. My medical team therefore advised that I should undergo a course of preventative chemotherapy, and I'm now in the early stages of that treatment. The words hung in the air for a moment after she spoke them. Cancer. The word that had terrified her when she first heard it was now spoken aloud, shared with the world, no longer a secret to be hidden. There was something liberating about finally saying it, about removing the power it had held over her through secrecy. This, of course, came as a huge shock, and William and I have been doing everything we can to process and manage this privately, for the sake of our young family. As you can imagine, this has taken time. It has taken me time to recover from major surgery in order to start my treatment. But most importantly, it has taken us time to explain everything to George, Charlotte, and Louis in a way that's appropriate for them and to reassure them that I'm going to be okay. Catherine thought of her children as she spoke these words, particularly of the conversation she and William had had with them the previous evening. They had told the children that Mummy was going to talk to everyone about being sick and that people might want to talk about it at school. George had asked very practically if this meant she would be in the newspapers more, and Charlotte had wanted to know if people would send more get-well cards, like they had after other times when royal family members had been ill. As I've said to them, I am well and getting stronger every day by focusing on the things that will help me heal, in my mind, body, and spirits. Having William by my side is a great source of comfort and reassurance too, as is the love, support, and kindness that has been shown by so many of you. It means so much to us both. The mention of the public support was deeply felt. Although Catherine had not been able to read the letters and messages directly during her worst days of treatment, William had shared some of them with her, and the palace staff had compiled summaries of the thousands of well wishes that had arrived from around the world. Even without knowing the full truth of her situation, people had sensed that something serious was happening and had responded with genuine concern and affection. We hope that you'll understand that as a family, we now need some time, space, and privacy while I complete my treatment. My work has always brought me a deep sense of joy, and I look forward to being back when I am able. But for now, I must focus on making a full recovery. This part of the statement had been the most carefully considered. Catherine was determined to return to her royal duties, but she also understood that her recovery would need to take precedence over any public expectations or official schedule. The chemotherapy regimen would continue for several more months, and while she was tolerating it better than expected, there would still be days when she simply would not be well enough to fulfill public engagements. At this time, I'm also thinking of all those whose lives have been affected by cancer. For everyone facing this disease, in whatever form, please do not lose faith or hope. You are not alone. These final words were perhaps the most important to Catherine. Throughout her treatment, she had been acutely aware of her privilege in having access to the best medical care, the most comfortable treatment environment, and the luxury of privacy during her recovery. Most people facing cancer did not have these advantages, and she wanted them to know that despite the differences in their circumstances, she understood something of what they were experiencing. When the filming was complete, Catherine felt emotionally drained but also oddly energized. For the first time in months, she felt like herself again. Not the mysterious absent princess that the media had been speculating about, not the patient defined by her diagnosis and treatment, but Catherine, a woman who had faced something difficult and was working her way through it with courage and determination. The response to the statement was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours of its release, messages of support began pouring in from world leaders, celebrities, and ordinary people from every corner of the globe. The official royal social media accounts were flooded with comments expressing love, prayers, and encouragement. The hashtag that emerged organically, #StandWithCatherine, began trending worldwide within the first hour. Margaret Thompson at the Birmingham Children's Hospital called the palace within hours of the statement's release, not to request a rescheduled visit, but simply to express her admiration for Catherine's courage and to let her know that the young patients in her ward were already making new drawings for their princess. Emma Collins from the Early Childhood Foundation sent a personal message through official channels, expressing not just her support for Catherine's recovery, but her gratitude for the princess's decision to speak so honestly about her experience. Emma had lost her own mother to cancer several years earlier, and she understood the particular courage it took to make such a private struggle public. The international media response was largely respectful and supportive, a marked contrast to the speculation and conspiracy theories that had dominated coverage during Catherine's absence. Editorial writers praised her decision to speak directly to the public and noted the stark difference between the dignity of her actual situation and the wild rumors that had circulated in the absence of information. Medical experts appeared on news programs to explain that Catherine's experience was unfortunately common, that many cancers were discovered incidentally during other procedures, and that early detection and aggressive treatment often led to excellent outcomes. Cancer research organizations reported significant increases in donations and inquiries about early screening programs in the days following Catherine's statement. Perhaps most importantly for Catherine personally, the response from other cancer patients and their families was overwhelmingly positive. Support groups and cancer charities shared her video widely, using it as an example of how to talk about the disease with honesty and hope rather than fear and secrecy. In the days that followed, Catherine began to understand that her decision to speak publicly about her diagnosis had accomplished something she had not fully anticipated. By refusing to hide from her illness, by presenting it as one challenge among many that could be faced with courage and support, she had helped to reduce some of the stigma and fear that surrounded cancer. The palace announced that while Catherine would not return to a full schedule of public engagements until her treatment was complete, she would gradually resume some of her most important work as her health allowed. The Early Childhood Foundation would continue its planned initiatives with her involvement as appropriate, and her other charitable organizations could begin planning for her eventual full return. Most importantly, Catherine had reclaimed control of her own narrative. No longer would she be defined by speculation and rumor. She had chosen to trust the public with her truth, and they had responded with the compassion and support that made her role as their future queen not just bearable, but meaningful. As she tucked her children into bed that night, George asked her if she felt better now that everyone knew she had been sick. Catherine considered the question carefully before answering. She did feel better, not because her medical situation had changed, but because she no longer had to carry the burden of secrecy. She could face her recovery with the support and understanding of the people she served, and that made all the difference in the world.